This is a case that is not only horrific, but also full of suspicion. An assailant knocked out a 9-year-old girl named Amelia during a rainy night, dragged her hundreds of meters along a muddy path, gouged out her eyes, and hid the body in a bamboo forest. Given the sheer cruelty of the act, everyone thought the perpetrator would surely be sentenced to death and immediately executed. However, the strange thing is that afterward, the whole village organized a solemn funeral for the culprit, something a cold-blooded murderer could never receive. It was as if there were hidden circumstances that outsiders didn't know about. And for me, a reporter specializing in digging up the truth behind cases, this one truly intrigued me. I was certain there was a story behind it that ordinary people couldn't see, but I never expected that story to be so grim. The reason I learned about this case was through a friend, David, who was originally from the village. I vaguely overheard him talking about it, although his entire family had left the village a long time ago. When he knew I was interested, he still invited me back to his hometown to find out more. On the way back, David recounted in more detail what he knew. The village is nestled at the foot of a secluded mountain, with houses spread out along intersecting paths. The vegetation is lush, and the village paths are all small, with many places lacking streetlights, completely dark. Near the eastern end of the village was a particularly unique household, with only a mother and daughter. The husband traveled far for work, initially coming home often, but later disappeared completely, essentially abandoning his wife and child. The victim was the daughter, Amelia. The night of the murder, the weather was bad with drizzling rain and muddy roads. In the countryside, usually by 8 or 9 p.m., the entire village has turned off their lights and gone to sleep. The scene was steeped in silence. Around 10 p.m., Amelia's mother suddenly suffered a heart attack, but at that exact moment, the medicine had run out. There was only a small clinic in the village, located all the way at the western end. To buy medicine, one had to cross winding, unlit, pitch-black roads through the mountain village. Having no other choice, Amelia decided to brave the darkness to buy medicine for her mother. Tragically, she left and never returned all night. The next morning, her body was discovered in the bamboo forest by the village road. Over a dozen police officers arrived to examine the scene. The perpetrator had acted with extreme cruelty. Before she died, Amelia was beaten until her face was disfigured. Half of her fingers were broken, both legs were severely injured, especially her knees, which were crushed, exposing white bone. Clearly from being dragged along the muddy road when her body was taken into the forest. Most frighteningly, her eyes were gone, leaving only 2 bloody sockets. Forensic results showed the culprit had used a tree branch to gouge them out. Clearly, the killer had not brought any tools. This was an impulsive murder, likely committed by someone in the village. The police immediately launched an investigation, questioning the villagers, and quickly found the culprit. No one expected it to be Isabella, Amelia's neighbor, a middle-aged woman who appeared gentle and simple on the outside. She had treated Amelia well on a daily basis. So everyone was shocked when she turned out to be the one capable of such a brutal act. The motive was simply a small amount of money. That night, before going to buy the medicine, Amelia had knocked on Isabella's door, but Isabella didn't open it. However, greed arose in her heart. She knew Amelia going to buy medicine would certainly be carrying money. Moreover, she knew the mother and daughter kept all their savings in a small wallet. At only 9 years old, Amelia didn't know the price of the medicine, so she carried the entire wallet. Isabella followed her, picking up a wooden stick along the way. When Amelia reached a deserted stretch of road, Isabella suddenly struck her hard on the back of the neck. Amelia fell, but, worried about her mother, was not completely unconscious. Isabella quickly grabbed the wallet, but Amelia held onto it tightly. To snatch it, the woman broke the child's tiny fingers one by one. Amelia's eyes widened, and she even tried to scream for help, which terrified Isabella. Firstly, the child had clearly seen her face. Secondly, if she screamed, Isabella wouldn't be able to escape. In a panic, Isabella continued to swing the stick, hitting the girl's face directly. Once, twice, 3 times. It's unclear how many times, only stopping when Amelia fell silent. Afterward, to avoid early detection, she dragged the body deep into the bamboo forest and dumped it there. And why did she gouge out the child's eyes? Only because of superstition. The ancients believed that people remember everything before they die, even when they turn into ghosts. Amelia had seen Isabella's face, so she was afraid the child would become a vengeful spirit and return for revenge. Thus, she used a tree branch to carve out the girl's eyes. The reason Isabella needed the money was simple. Her son was addicted to gambling and heavily in debt. Loan sharks had come to her house, threatening to chop off her son's hands if she didn't pay. She was desperate to find money to save her son. But in the end, the person she harmed was not just Amelia, but also her mother. The woman, who had just recovered from a heart attack, had to witness her only daughter being brutally murdered. Amelia was her mother's only hope for life. But upon hearing the dreadful news, the mother chose to end her life right there in her old house. She passed away even sooner than the wicked culprit. As for Isabella, she was quickly arrested, put on trial, and received the highest sentence. That is the entire story. Poverty sometimes not only leads people to despair, but can also turn them into something even more terrifying than ghosts. David finished recounting the entire incident, but our car hadn't yet reached the village. The one thing I still couldn't understand was, why did the whole village then organize a funeral for the culprit? David replied, "It's because I found it strange that I invited you back here to investigate." And the comparison makes it even more absurd. Amelia and her mother, they were hastily cremated later, and their ashes were placed right in the old house. They didn't even have a proper funeral. Doesn't that strike you as strange? I shivered. This is truly bizarre. What more is there to say? Remember one thing. I'm back this time to visit my eldest uncle, Uncle George, and I'll be staying for a few days. You absolutely must not say you are a reporter. The villagers here are very wary of outsiders, and if you reveal yourself, they'll immediately kick you out. Just say, you are my driver. This place is both closed off and stubborn. If Uncle George hadn't told me, I wouldn't have known about this case, let alone the strange funeral. I silently nodded, my mind still grappling with the suspicion. It was one thing not to sympathize with the victim, but to show support for the cruel perpetrator. There must be something fishy going on. Before long, David stopped the car. Through the window, I saw the village gate right ahead. We had arrived. The parking spot was an empty lot outside the village. Besides our car, there were a few others parked there. I asked, "Are there no roads for cars to enter the village?" "There are, but they are all small and inconvenient. It's been the custom for a long time. If you want to drive a car in, you have to ask the village head for permission first," David said as he got out of the car. I got out too, took my bag from the trunk, and followed him on foot. His parents passed away early, but fortunately the ancestral house remains, and it's habitable after a quick tidy up. The houses in the village are all old style with earthen walls and tiled roofs, yet the population is quite large. Along the way, many people greeted David. They were even young people, which is rare in mountain areas where few young people choose to stay. Everyone knew each other, and were surprised that David returned without notice. Some households even opened their private doors to greet him with unusual enthusiasm. This very enthusiasm made me, a person who grew up in the city, feel out of place. It was only a few hundred meters from the beginning of the village to his old house, yet it took us almost half an hour to arrive. After putting down our luggage and doing a quick cleaning, it was already late afternoon. David went to the neighbor's house to ask for some rice and vegetables, and we cooked a simple meal. We both decided to rest first and ask questions the next day to avoid suspicion. When night fell, looking out from the door, the entire village was dark, with hardly any lights. I had a feeling this place must be hiding many unspeakable secrets. The next morning, we woke up early. Our first destination was the old house of Amelia and her mother at the eastern end of the village. The case had passed a few months, and the village had a new plan. The house was going to be demolished. The strange thing was that the demolition was being carried out by a few villagers themselves by hand. While it was clearly possible to hire a vehicle to bring up a small excavator, which would be much faster, they insisted on using manpower and transported the bricks and tiles with agricultural vehicles. The person leading the group was a strong farmer around 40 years old, whom David called Robert. We approached to strike up a conversation. After a few pleasantries, David skillfully brought up the house and the case of Amelia and her mother. Robert asked in return how much David knew, and David didn't hide it, recounting what he had heard from his eldest uncle. Naturally, he also asked why the village organized a funeral for Isabella, but not for Amelia and her mother. Clearly, the latter were the victims, who were innocent and pitiful. Hearing this, Robert just smiled and replied, "The dead are done for, it no longer matters how they lived. Isabella's funeral wasn't for her either. That farewell ceremony wasn't meant for her." David and I looked at each other, bewildered. The sentence sounded reasonable, but seemed to hide another meaning. When David tried to ask further, Robert only smiled, mysteriously telling him not to be curious. Excessive curiosity is not good. You came back to visit your eldest uncle, so go see him. After saying that, he turned back to continue demolishing the house with his group. Not only me, but David was also confused. Amelia's house was being torn down like that. There would surely be nothing left inside. We saw no point in going in. We had no choice but to go look for David's eldest uncle, Uncle George. The reason we didn't go right away yesterday was that he lived in a very secluded spot. The entire village has only one main road running through it. Most households are along that road, which is also the only route cars can take, but there are still households living high up on the mountain. David's eldest uncle was one of them. He was over 60, had spent his entire life connected to the mountains and forests, and had never married. Perhaps he would live and rest in this mountainous region. His younger siblings, meaning his youngest uncle and David's mother, had both passed away. Consequently, David was his closest relative. The path up the mountain began from a small branch off the main village road, leading straight up the slope. All around was just wild forest and dense bamboo. After about 20 minutes of walking, a low house with an old tiled earth roof appeared before us. As if he knew we were coming, the uncle had already set out a small wooden chair and was sitting on the porch. As soon as he saw us, he smiled brightly and waved hello. David quickly ran forward. I followed. The uncle welcomed us warmly, even brewing the local specialty, wild tea. It is a drink made from tea leaves mixed with wild vegetables, mashed and boiled, resulting in a dark green liquid. In the old days of poverty, this was used both as a drink and a substitute for food. The taste was slightly bitter, but not as difficult to swallow as I imagined. We drank and chatted. When the conversation turned to the tragedy of Amelia and her mother, the uncle suddenly changed the subject and asked, "David, you left the village when you were young. Your parents probably never told you about the taboos here, did they?" David looked slightly stunned and nodded. "Well, then today I will tell you too," the uncle said. "This is not just a story. It is the secret that has existed for generations in this village." He calmly began, "The village is 100 years old, the inhabitants live off the mountain, and resources are scarce. During times of strife and famine, the foot of the mountain suffered drought, while the mountain itself was battered by fierce winds, leading to crop failure. In winter, snow covered everything, and the villagers were on the brink of extinction. It was at that moment that the mountain god appeared. He guided the villagers to find a wild vegetable that could be mashed and cooked, eaten with anything from leaves to roots, similar to how they make wild tea. This food not only staved off hunger, but also kept them warm. Thanks to it, the entire village survived the famine. But then, disaster struck. 3 young men died in a deserted area. One of them was the one who committed the murder, but he too perished at the scene. From this event, the villagers believed that the mountain god does not permit human transgression. Anyone who violates the forbidden zone will be struck down by the god's guardian. That guardian does not appear in a physical form, but will possess someone, using their body to punish the transgressor. Therefore, the evildoer became a tool for maintaining the law. Afterward, the village organized a solemn funeral for him, because in the eyes of the villagers, he had acted on behalf of the mountain god to preserve order, in exchange for everyone's survival. At this point, I couldn't help but immediately link it to the tragedy of Amelia and her mother. I blurted out, "So, in everyone's eyes, Amelia was the one who offended the gods, and Isabella became the guardian?" The uncle only smiled without answering. This was too preposterous. Not only me, but David was also annoyed. "That's not right, uncle. Amelia was just a little girl who went down to the town to buy medicine, not up the mountain. Moreover, what era is this? How can there still be talk of the mountain god and deities? The uncle's face grew serious and he spoke slowly. I know you won't believe it, but the day you truly do believe, David, promise me one thing. From then on, never pry into the matters of your parents again. Because there are things in this world that cannot be clearly explained. David froze, and so did I. I thought we only came back here to investigate Amelia's case. Who knew? It turned out he also wanted to investigate a secret about his own parents. What exactly were they hiding from him? After that, the uncle avoided the topic and turned to telling old stories. David also didn't dare to ask any more about the case, nor did he mention his parents, just following the flow of the conversation. His avoidance made me even more suspicious. It seemed, once his parents were brought up, he became noticeably reserved. Finally, the uncle said he needed to rest and told us to come back tomorrow. It was only close to noon then, but we didn't feel comfortable saying anything, so we had to take our leave. Going down the mountain, I was eager to grill David about what his parents had hidden that he was so persistently seeking. But before I could ask, he suddenly acted strangely, running quickly down the slope, urging me to follow with an odd excitement. Everyone knows you shouldn't run on a mountain. One fall is dangerous. David, what are you doing? Why are you running? I had to chase after him. Running for a while, I realized something was wrong. We were clearly going down the mountain, but I don't know when the path had turned into an uphill climb. I immediately yanked him back and yelled, "Are you crazy? We're lost and you're running like you're being chased by a ghost. What's wrong with you?" He turned around, his face panicked. "Didn't you hear it?" I heard what, the cold wind? A gust of cold wind swept over us in the middle of the day, and I involuntarily shivered. He whispered, "Listen, listen." Carefully. I strained my ears, but apart from the rustling of leaves in the wind, there was nothing else. "No, don't listen anymore. Look over there," he shouted, pointing behind me. I turned my head and the blood in my veins suddenly ran cold. Not far away, on the trunk of an old tree, a human face stood out. No, I wasn't mistaken. It was distorted and ugly, but it was clearly a face. That face even curled its mouth, flashing a grotesque smile toward me. Although it was just rough bark, those dark lines seemed to be seamlessly arranged into a moving face. "Run! Hurry!" David's shout snapped me out of the shock. When I turned my head, he was already far away. "Damn it, wait for me!" I also started running as fast as I could. The two of us ran until the world seemed to spin, unable to distinguish direction. But the sound of a sinister laugh seemed to echo in my ears. The tree trunks around us also seemed to come alive. Whenever the wind blew, they seemed to stir, and this was clearly in the middle of the day. In broad daylight, we were encountering something akin to a ghost. How could this be? We just kept running as if for our lives. Sweat drenched us, yet we didn't feel tired. It took perhaps more than half an hour before David finally slowed down, and I stayed close behind. We walked cautiously along the narrow path, looking back with every step, our eyes constantly scanning all sides, afraid of those unnatural things following us. Fortunately, David was still somewhat familiar with this mountain area, but a mountain is still a mountain, and mountain paths are never easy. In our fear, we even had to stoop low to navigate some dangerous sections. Too much time had passed. We had almost crossed an entire mountain when we finally glimpsed the village. We had returned. By then, the sky was already turning to dusk. Back at David's house, we were almost completely exhausted. We hadn't eaten or drunk anything all day. Managing to drag ourselves back was a miracle. After a few sips of water, we both collapsed onto the living room floor, our minds almost blank, and immediately fell into a deep, dizzying sleep. It wasn't until the next morning, around 9 a.m., that I woke up, my entire body feeling weak. David was also awake, and the person who woke us was Robert. Yesterday, we didn't even bother to close the gate when we got home, showing how panicked and tired we were. Still dazed upon waking, I thought Robert had come to call us for breakfast, but he brought news that stunned us even more. "Wake up, David. Your eldest uncle has had an accident." David and I jumped up, completely alert. "What? He's gone? He passed away?" When I regained my composure, I was with a group of villagers heading to Uncle George's house. His body had already been placed in the coffin. Inside the house, people began setting up the funeral hall, laying down straw. Just yesterday, he was lucid, even personally brewing tea for us. Yet today, he was gone. We heard he passed away from a sudden heart attack. The village doctor had examined him and confirmed there were no signs of life. Perhaps due to the lingering shock from the ghostly encounter yesterday, my mind was hazy all day, only knowing to follow the instructions of Robert and everyone else like a machine, helping with the funeral preparations. David was the same. According to the local custom, family members must hold a vigil for 3 days before cremation. This is also a time for friends and relatives to pay their respects. But besides David, the uncle had no close relatives and his friends were just the villagers. Therefore, from the afternoon onward, the funeral became sparse and cold. In a blink, night fell. Tonight, David and I had to keep watch in the house that had become the funeral hall. Even though there was a coffin inside, the bright lamps and lit candles made it not particularly scary for us. Around 8 or 9 p.m., only the two of us remained. The uncle lived far from the neighborhood, and since this was the countryside, Robert and everyone else had left early. After a busy day, we finally sat down on the spread-out straw, sighing for a temporary rest. It was then that I asked David the question that had been weighing on my mind since yesterday. Why did you come back after so many years to inquire about your parents? There is one thing I just can't figure out, David sighed. A month ago, a fiduciary company contacted me, saying that the deadline for handing over a consigned inheritance had arrived. And it was assets left by my parents in an investment fund, valued at tens of millions. What? I was stunned. In my eyes, David was just an ordinary person, not from a wealthy background, and certainly not likely to have such a huge inheritance. I also found it hard to believe, but even stranger, I haven't told you yet. My uncle also gave me a shockingly large sum of assets, huh? I was even more astonished. Where would a person who lived his entire life in this remote countryside get money, let alone such a large sum? This was highly unusual. I looked up and met David's eyes. He was looking at me with an examining gaze, as if trying to gauge my reaction to the news. But apart from astonishment, I had no other reaction. I've searched everywhere, even through that fiduciary company, and still found no clues as to how my parents got that money. You understand, right? Besides, wanting to investigate Amelia's case, I also wanted to ask my uncle about this because he also owned a similar amount of wealth. I suspect the way they got the money might be from the same source. But how could anyone earn that kind of money in this village? David continued, it's not just the money. Even more strangely, my parents' household registration is in a remote village in another province, and even my birthplace is recorded there. But I have never set foot there, as if someone intentionally cut off all ties between them and this village. What do you mean? You remember yesterday my uncle warned me that if I truly believed in the mountain god here, I shouldn't investigate my parents anymore, right? Could it be that you think those assets were bestowed by the mountain god, and after receiving them, they were forced to leave this place? Remembering the ghostly encounter in broad daylight yesterday, I involuntarily trembled. If ghosts truly exist, then the existence of a mountain god wouldn't be strange anymore, would it? However, David shook his head. No, don't you see? My uncle seemed certain that we would eventually have to accept the existence of the mountain god, right? I nodded softly. That's true. And yesterday, our conversation with my uncle was cut short. He also told us to come back and find him today. It's as if he would only continue to talk once we truly believed in the mountain god. At this point, David suddenly paused, his eyes seemingly waiting for me to continue. I suddenly understood what he was thinking. You mean our ghostly encounter yesterday was already part of your uncle's plan? David nodded. Perhaps he arranged for us to encounter that scene, to force us to believe in the existence of the mountain god. That way, we would more easily accept whatever he wanted to reveal next. But how could my uncle have done that? What was his true goal? If your uncle hadn't passed away so suddenly, maybe today we would have known the truth. Wait, could it be that your uncle's death? I suddenly turned my head to stare at the coffin in the main hall. I was startled by my own speculation. David also looked over and said, yes, I think so too. My uncle originally planned to tell me something today, but he was prevented. At that moment, the funeral hall was oppressively silent. After a long while, David sighed and said, we can't leave this village until the mourning period is over. Perhaps Robert and the others will secretly monitor us during these days to see if we know anything. If we continue to investigate, I'm afraid it will be dangerous. I knew this situation was potentially more dangerous than imagined, because Amelia's case was likely part of that secret. But I wasn't the type to back down easily. What is there to be afraid of? I have to see what kind of devious scheme this place is hiding. David glanced around and whispered, "Okay, then let's take advantage of this time when no one is paying attention and try to search through my uncle's belongings for any clues." To be honest, I didn't have high hopes. The funeral arrangements were made by Robert. If the uncle had left anything behind, it would likely have been cleaned up long ago. But there was nothing else to do besides sit vigil. So we spent several hours ransacking the entire house. The result was clear evidence that the house had already been searched by others. We found nothing. It wasn't until David suddenly remembered something. Yesterday, my uncle said that there are many things in this world that are difficult to clearly explain. Does that mean it relates to the mountain god? I found it amusing. I never really believed in ghosts or deities. I thought about the phenomena yesterday again. There might be a reasonable explanation, but David shook his head. No, that's my uncle's habit. When he encounters things that cannot be expressed in words, he often carves them instead of just talking. Carves? But I didn't see any paintings in the house, not on paper. When he was young, he was a carpenter, and often carved into wood, meaning anywhere made of wood. Yes, search carefully again. So, we started searching again, from the wooden chests and wardrobes to the wooden bed. Flipping over the thick mattress and blankets, we finally found carvings under the bed planks. I looked at the crooked lines, momentarily confused. David immediately recognized it as a map. Look at the starting point. Isn't this house? I suddenly understood. Could it lead to the forbidden area they call the place of the mountain god? Most likely, yes. David's eyes lit up. Perhaps that is the place that holds all the secrets. He asked Hurst, "Did you fully charge your flashlight?" I nodded. In a place this remote, you can't go into the mountains without a flashlight. Can we really leave? I was slightly worried. Yes, today is only the first day of the funeral. Robert has been busy all day. He probably won't have the energy to guard us all night. This is our chance. If we truly want to find out everything, of course we do. David, who was generally cautious, first looked around the house. Only after confirming no one was following us did he signal for me to go with him. We followed the map, shining our flashlights, and quietly set off. At that moment, I overlooked a detail. I had a reason to be less afraid and dared to explore at night. But why did David not show any signs of fear? By ignoring this point, I later realized I had misjudged him. The map was indeed very clear. No one would believe it wasn't intentional. Following the mountain path, we realized our destination was very far, requiring us to cross this entire mountain and then descend from the back slope into a valley midway down the other side. We walked continuously for more than 2 hours, only overcoming the distance as the eastern sky gradually began to lighten. Finally, a flat clearing several dozen acres wide appeared before our eyes. It was nothing short of terraced fields, densely covered with a single type of plant. They grew tall, lush, and chaotic. Combined with the faint light of dawn, the sight made me freeze right there, because I knew what that plant was. This was an entire cannabis field. Each acre must have contained hundreds, even several hundred plants, and they absolutely could not be growing naturally. David was also stunned, trembling as he whispered, "So this is the reason my parents and even my uncle had so much money." The scene before us virtually explained the entire mystery. The so-called mountain god or wild vegetable gifts are actually just this plant. There is no such thing as a curse. I suddenly understood why David and I had experienced hallucinations yesterday. The answer lies right in the wild tea Uncle George brewed for us. Wild vegetable tea? Not at all. That was merely food and drink mixed with fresh cannabis leaves. The illusion of encountering ghosts and gods is simply the reaction after being exposed to a hallucinogenic substance. This village is nothing more than a drug manufacturing den. It was no wonder that young people were willing to stay in such a remote place. No wonder the village had such strict rules, even forbidding cars from entering and exiting. This meant that the deaths of Amelia and her mother, and even Isabella, were likely not as simple as they seemed. I pulled out my phone, quickly taking dozens of photos and recording a video clip. intending to immediately send it or upload it to cloud storage, but several attempts failed. Looking closely, I realized this area had absolutely no signal. Even GPS couldn't locate us. Fortunately, the map left by Uncle George was saved. Finding this place again wouldn't be difficult. The only thing was, David was still dazed, not yet recovered from the shock. It wasn't until I finished collecting all the evidence and put my phone away that he slowly turned around and asked a question. "Did you already guess it?" I asked back in surprise. "Guess what?" David looked at me seriously, word for word. "You said you came here to investigate Amelia's case, but if you think about it, you don't seem particularly concerned about that case. On the contrary, you're particularly interested in the secrets of the village. And you didn't even show any fear when we encountered that strange thing yesterday." I'm a native villager, so not being afraid is understandable, but you are different. I remained silent. The sky was gradually getting lighter. Being stuck in the mountains and holding such a shocking secret, our situation was extremely dangerous. Because soon, Robert and his group would realize we were absent from the funeral. They would surely search everywhere and would find us sooner or later. If we were caught, it would be the end of us. At this moment, I had to rely on David's help. That also meant I couldn't hide everything from him. I asked him, "David, do you know Amelia's father's name?" "Huh?" "His name is Richard. Outwardly a clothing salesman who traveled everywhere for business." I pointed toward the field in front of us and continued, "But in reality, he was the distributor of that product outside. I had brief contact with him." David froze, instantly realizing, I understand. Amelia's father was like my parents, living under a false identity. The only difference is that my parents protected me quite well. Perhaps while thinking, he had realized his parents' true occupation. "Richard died suddenly 2 months ago," David sighed. "Even this is similar to my parents. They also passed away at the same time." I slowly continued, "I don't dare guess much about your parents, but I know a little about Richard. Because at that time, he had the intention to withdraw and tried to contact me, saying he had a shocking secret he wanted to expose to the world." David gasped, blurting out, "He wanted to expose the secret of this village." I nodded. "It's probably true, but then he was discovered. And after that, he went missing, and finally, he couldn't even save his life. And his wife and daughter couldn't escape either. I even suspect his wife and daughter were never willingly living in the village, but were kept as a means to control him. Once he died, they lost their value. And Isabella in that incident? I believe that was just a slip-up in handling. Since they couldn't conceal it, they had to push her out to take the blame. That's why there was that solemn funeral. The purpose was to serve as a deterrent. Anyone who dares to betray will meet the same end as Richard. And anyone who sacrifices themselves for the village will be honored like Isabella." David looked at me, his eyes both suspicious and thoughtful. "You know a lot. Have you never told anyone about these things?" Of course, I couldn't say anything before because I had no evidence, but now it's different. We have full evidence. After saying that, I suddenly noticed the subtle difference in David's gaze toward me. Then, he asked a question that sent a chill down my spine. "So, you really are a reporter?" I froze. "What do you mean, really? If I'm not a reporter, what am I? What do you mean?" David laughed as if a burden had been lifted. "So, we thought you were a cop. That's why we were so tense. I didn't expect you to just be a reporter." "Well, that makes things easier." "We?" I suddenly felt a pang of apprehension. The "we" he spoke of. Could it be? My whole body went cold. David, he deliberately led me here so I could see the so-called truth with my own eyes. Then, right before that secret, he tricked me into revealing my true identity. But how could that be? If he was one of them, then why did Uncle George... So, were you also involved in the death of Uncle George? I couldn't understand why this was happening. David sighed softly and said he didn't know I had continued my parents' work. I took the opportunity of searching for the truth to test whether he would reveal the secret or not. He paused for a moment and continued, but perhaps he realized it. Otherwise, why do you think he brewed that kind of tea for us to drink? Actually, he didn't brew it for me, but for you so that you could discover something. So that's how it was. I finally understood. In other words, You're leading me back here to investigate Amelia's case was actually something you, along with them, Robert and the other villagers, had planned beforehand. Please, David said with a bitter smile. How else could a complete stranger be brought into the village so icily? Do you still not clearly know what business we are in? And you? Your curiosity killed the cat. The case was over. Why did you have to dig it up? You made me think you were an undercover cop investigating us, which is why I staged this whole scene to bring you here, to probe whether the police were paying attention to us. Well, never mind. Now that everything is out in the open, I'm sure you can guess what your final outcome will be, right? I swallowed hard. Of course, I knew I would disappear forever, just like Amelia. No, maybe even more miserably, because in this desolate mountain forest, perhaps even my bones would never be discovered by anyone. In this moment of danger, I forced myself to remain calm. I took a few steps back, forcing a faint smile, and retorted, "Are you planning to act right here? Just you alone? It's not certain who will win and who will lose yet." David ignored me, pointing in several directions around us. Over there, and over there too, are all people I called ahead of time. What do you think? Our line of work involves risking our lives, so who would be foolish enough to take a risk alone? I followed his pointing finger and saw figures indeed lurking around. It's over. Forget fighting back. I didn't even have a chance to run. With so many people who knew the terrain so well, my chances of survival were virtually zero. Damn it, this is the end. I smiled bitterly, but I still tried to ask one last question. Since it's come to this, I just want to know one last thing. You people were the ones who killed Richard first, right? David chuckled faintly. If there's no deterrent, what happens if there's a future traitor? You mean killing Amelia and her mother was just to deter others? His voice was light, as if recounting something utterly unrelated to him. Of course, if someone wants to betray us in the future, their family, regardless of age, must suffer the worst fate. To let everyone see with their own eyes that betrayal means the whole family will have no way to live. Who would dare to make a move then? I took a deep breath. The sun had risen, but his words still sent a chill down my spine. David sighed, his voice full of mock reproach. You, as a reporter, why did you dig so much? Didn't you just bring trouble upon yourself? Oh, I looked up at the sun on the horizon. What is light for? It is to dispel the darkness. Huh, David sneered derisively. I put my phone away and took out another device as large as a brick. Have you ever seen this? It's a satellite phone. Even if you block the surrounding signals, it can still make calls. And yes, it is currently on a call. The person on the other end is both recording and locating our position. David was stunned, speechless. I put the phone on speaker and asked into the device, "How much longer until you reach my position?" A voice rang out from the phone. 10 minutes. Finally, David reacted. His face contorted viciously and he lunged towards me, screaming maniacally, "Bastard, I'll kill you!" I pulled the gun hidden behind my back. Bang! The bullet went straight into his right chest. He stumbled and fell to the ground, his face still full of disbelief. I quickly rolled behind cover, hiding myself tightly. The group of people lurking around must have seen everything. They would either charge to kill me or take the opportunity to flee. David lay sprawled out, still glaring at me, the blood flowing constantly. He no longer had the strength to move. You? Who are you, really? That's right, I'm really a police officer. 10 minutes passed very quickly and my teammates arrived in time. The villagers did not attack but fled, yet they could not escape. All the paths down the mountain were blocked by my comrades. They only had two choices: be arrested or die in the mountains. David was still alive. We had to carry him down. I had a slight regret for not finishing him off immediately. Because of him, because of their heinous crimes. The drugs that have flowed into the market from this place have been enough to destroy countless families. The way they treated Richard and his wife and daughter alone made me furious enough to shoot him dead. Richard was a mid-level informant we had developed. He didn't immediately join the police side because he was worried about his family, who were still being held in the village. He wanted to find a way to get his wife and daughter out before cooperating. Unfortunately, he failed. At the same time, a counter-narcotics officer who met with him also went missing. To this day, we still haven't found their bodies and don't know what they endured. But the traffickers not only killed Richard but also deliberately established their authority by killing his wife and daughter, as an example. I cannot imagine how an entire village could heartlessly conspire to kill a little girl like that. If Amelia's body hadn't been accidentally discovered by a forest patrol, this case would never have become an investigation, and no one would have turned their attention to this village. Because Richard never mentioned this place in his file, their sacrifice will not be in vain. We will start from this village and gradually wipe out the entire drug trafficking network behind it. The sun has risen, as if it has dispelled the darkness. But those who fell in that darkness, will anyone ever know about them?